from Christ. You're separated. And he also is going to tell the Corinthians that if you go too far the other way and you accept Christian freedom to the point that it's basically sin, and you accept sin in your midst, then basically what you're doing is the same thing. And he says you're not going to inherit the kingdom of God. So there's a balance here that I think is important. It really tells us, the Corinthian letters tells us really what happens when Christians become too proud, they become too conceited, and that they abuse the freedom of God. Okay, I think that 1 Corinthians was one of the most influential writings in the early church. One scholar said that the letters of Paul tell us what happens when God allows us to, or basically his letters allows us to take the roof off churches, house churches, whatever, and actually look inside and tell what the inner workings are doing. It's especially true at the church here at Corinth. It was addressed to a church in its early years, and this was an incredibly diverse group of Christians. It was a group of Jews, but also an incredibly diverse mixture of Gentiles. It was established in a major city of the Roman Empire. In fact, some say it was the third leading city in the Roman Empire, before or after, I would say, Rome, Alexandria, Egypt, and Corinth probably was the third most influential city. It was addressed at a time that Paul was busiest with his missionary work. And it's really addressed to a specific church, but I think the themes are for churches of any age. Themes apply to Signal Mountain today. He's giving us really a unique look at what a church should do and shouldn't do. They were proud. These people were Jews, they were Gentiles, they were proud, they were materialistic, they were independent, and they were just having a hard time living the Christian life. Some were asking, what are we supposed to do? Or how are we supposed to live in this city? I think that's some of the questions they were asking. This is a Corinthian culture that we live in today. We live in a paganistic, nihilistic, God-scoffing, and I would even say God-hating society. So again, the themes that we talk about today are not going to be themes that are some ancient, of interest of 2,000 years ago, but they're going to really affect us as we study, take apart really 1 Corinthians. In order to get a sense of how do you start to do an introduction to 1 Corinthians? We're not going to hit the text today. We're going to talk about the book or the letter. But there are four factors, I think, one way to approach it is four factors. And the first is, who was its founder? And the second, the location of the church. The third was when it was established. And finally, some people who made up its membership. And I have some of those people listed on the handout. We first say the Corinthian church was created by God. Everybody agrees with that, except but Paul was its founder and its father in a unique sense. The church at Corinth bears his imprint as being the founder. Now, there were co-workers in the church we know about. Paul planted, Apollos watered, etc. There were co-workers who worked for the teaching in the church here and the continuing work there. But Paul was the apostle that really brought this church to life through his teaching Christ Jesus. The personality of the church, I think every organization has its own personality, don't you? I can walk into a store. It's kind of a little hobby of mine sometimes. Walk into a store sometimes and you can sometimes sense the personality of that organization. And every store, Walmart in Signal Mountain is not the same as Walmart in Hickson. Every organization has its own personality. And so churches are the same way. They have their own personality. And so, there was a personality of the Corinthian church. I think one of the big drivers of the church in Corinth was its strategic location. Corinth was really in a strategic spot. I don't know if you can see, it's pretty small. I had to reduce it to keep this to one page, but there's a map of Greece. And, Greece is sort of in two big areas, and they're linked together by only a 4-mile piece of land, an isthmus of Corinth, which is only about 4 miles in width. And the rest of it, if it wasn't for this isthmus, then the southern part of Greece would be an island. And so it's very strategic where it's located. The Gulf to the west of Corinth, there's the Gulf of Corinth that cuts into the land. And then on the east, the Saronic Gulf cuts into the land from the east side. So again, Corinth sits in this little land bridge. Well, you say, well, okay, why is that important? Well, the idea here is that it was natural. Think about north to south trade. Trade from the north, and particularly from Macedonia and from those areas. And you think about that kind of trade that went on through Sparta and Athens. Everything had to be funneled through Corinth to get to southern Greece, from the northern Corinth, and from other places above Greece. So there was a lot of north-south trade. Even more importantly, there was east to west trade on the Mediterranean. And you say, well, why is Corinth's not on the, right at the end of the landmass? Why is that important? And there's an easy explanation for that. North-south Mediterranean trade was important because on the southern tip of Greece, there was the Cape of Greece was one of the most dangerous shipping areas in the Mediterranean. It was the most dangerous shipping area, most shipwrecks in the Mediterranean. It was called the Cape of Malea. Now it's called Cape Matapon, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. But it was so dangerous, it was like pretty much the dangerous passage surrounding the tip of Africa, the Cape, I get these mixed up. I think Cape Horn is in Africa. Cape of Good Hope is South America. They're very dangerous to travel from a sailor standpoint. So you say, okay, again, why is that important? Well, the interesting thing was a lot of people looked for ways to avoid going around the tip of Greece. And there was even an old saying from sailors that said, let him who sails around Malea first make his will. So it told you how dangerous it was. So there was an alternative, and Corinth was the alternative. Sailors could I was going to say fly. No, they could sail up the Saronic Gulf, and if their ships were small enough, there were actually a roller system where they could take that ship, put it on rollers, and roll it 4 miles west, and then put it back out to sea in the Mediterranean on the other side. If it was too large, what they would do is they'd unload the cargo. They had thousands of slaves who worked there, and thousands of slaves would carry their cargo to a ship that was waiting on the other side. They would load that ship, and then they would be on their way. And that seems like a lot of work. But again, it says something. I think the 4-mile land bridge saved a 202-mile trip and a dangerous trip by sea around the tip of Greece. It was said that everything that you would ever want, everything you could ever need, was either bought and sold in Corinth or could be, or at least it went through the port of Corinth. So there was it was very important strategically located. It was kind of the hub of Greece for the east and west Mediterranean there. And so I mentioned that that's important. The other thing is there's a New Corinth and an Old Corinth. What we're dealing with in the New Testament is a New Corinth. The Old Corinth, a little bit of history there, 200 years before Christ, the Romans began to conquer the world, and the leading city actually was not Sparta or Athens from the standpoint of rebelling against Rome. It was Corinth. Corinth decided they were going to rebel against Rome, so there was a Roman general named Lucius Mummius, just for your information, and in 146 BC, he sacked the city of Rome, of Corinth, and he destroyed it. He reduced it to rubble. He didn't want anybody to live there. That was it. But you know about real estate. What's the idea? What's the old saying about real estate, particularly now? Location, location, location. Well, Julius Caesar in 46 BC, 100 years later, almost 100 years exactly, came in and he said, this is just too good a location. So he rebuilt the city, not as a Greek city, but as a Roman colony. So it was rebuilt, and again, realized how important it was. Within 20 years of rebuilding, it became a Roman province, and it became the Roman province of Achaia, which is pretty much was most of Greece at the time. Interesting thing about Romans, when the Romans established these colonies, what they did is they seated them with veterans from the wars. If you retired from the Roman army, instead of getting a 20-year pension, what you got was Roman citizenship, and you usually got some land in a colony. So if you're willing to go there and reclaim your land, you could live in that new colony. Well, that was a sneaky way of seeding these new colonies with loyal Roman citizens. And so, today we would call the whole city of Corinth, we call it cultural diversity, because that's truly what it was. Merchants came back quickly to the city, as you would expect. That's probably the reason that Julius Caesar jumped on that location. And there were also a good number of Jews who were merchants who came there. There were artisans who took up residence. Corinth was also even attracted Phoenicians and Phrygians who brought a lot of exotic customs. So it was a mixture of a lot of different kind of people. One historian described the New Corinth as a mixture of Greek and Romans who had intermarried with a mixture, and this is what he said, a mixture of the Phoenicians, a mass of Jews, ex-soldiers, philosophers, merchants, sailors, freedmen, slaves, hucksters, and every form of vice. It was a colony without aristocracy, without traditions, and without well-established citizens. It was also said to be a city on the move, and also a city on the make. So there was, according to many people, it was a constant flow of sailors, of traders, of pilgrims. It was diplomats and just people passing through. Okay, now you're maybe sitting here saying, okay, why do we need this background? Well, maybe we don't. Okay, but why do we need this kind of background? I would answer that and say that I just think it's interesting to know the context that Paul worked in, the people he worked with, and the problems that they had, and in trying to deal with how they did that. This is a cultural melting pot, and Paul did some of his greatest missionary work here. So, I think to understand the city of Corinth helps us to understand the problems that the church faced, and also, that again, I'll say this again, we face some of these same problems today. Well, when it was rebuilt, Corinth, the new Corinth, quickly became a center of wealth and power, of course. But besides trading, it was famous for mining, for manufacturing, and craftsmanship. A lot happened on that little 4-mile area. And it's understandable why Aquila and Priscilla might be encouraged to come to a place like that. And we'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute. But to show just one idea, one way to show how important Corinth was, they quickly reestablished some games that had been missing for 100 years, the Isthmian Games for the Isthmus of Corinth. They were second in prestige in the whole world to the Olympic Games. So these were very important athletic contests. And I think we can actually date that Paul was actually there in Corinth during one of these cycles, which we're pretty sure that he was. And so the idea here is that you see a lot, I've always said this, but I think Paul's a closet sports fan. And so he basically, you see a lot of things about wrestling and running races, and there are a lot of allusions to, I think probably this influenced Paul in some of his letters to the churches. We know the church was a mixture of influential people, and there were some uninfluential people or non-influential people there. But it also seems that Corinth had some wealthy members, and so this probably explains why Paul does come to them oftentimes for trying to pass the hat for particularly the poor Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. So there was some money in that church as well. Soon after it became New Corinth again, the Romans upgraded it from a provincial capital to a senatorial province. That's sort of the highest level in terms of the way the Romans looked at their areas. And what that ended up doing was bringing a lot of civil servants to Corinth. Erastus, who's mentioned in Acts, is probably one of those civil servants. Probably the secretarial skills of Tertius, who was with Paul in Corinth and wrote Romans from there. His secretary, probably one of that class of civil servants that we see. All right. I guess I'll stop for a minute. Take a breath. Any comments at this point? Everybody's just stunned, right? Oh, yeah. That guy has my notes. He basically has my notes. He always anticipates the next thing that's happening. Yeah, yes. I'm just seeing people that need a handout here. Yeah, my next question, thanks Danny, was what about the morality, I guess the morality of the Corinthians? Is that where you're going? Absolutely, yeah. Kind of the worst type, if you want to put grades on things, right? Okay, what else? Exactly. Good. Pagan, sexual immorality is going on there. One thing that's kind of interesting, I was doing some reading, and it said that there was a Greek word that was, we have an English word for it. I don't know how you say these, but the Greek word was koin. That's the word I was looking for. There was a koin Greek word, which has its base Corinthian. And to Corinthianize was sort of the idea here. And what it said is, the Greek term was describing living like a Corinthian. And what that meant was that it meant that you were sexually immoral and always drunk. Really, that to be a Corinthian, to be called a Corinthian was like that. And a Greek playwright observed that whenever a Corinthian was ever shown on stage in a Greek play, he was always drunk. This is kind of like the old Irish stereotype, the character that was always drinking or something. That's what it meant to be a Corinthian in that culture. Jeff mentioned sexual immorality, and Danny mentioned temples, and absolutely both right. In the old city of Corinth, there were two temples that overlooked the city. One was the temple to Aphrodite, and one was to Apollos. And the temple to Aphrodite, there were 1,000 priestesses who served in that temple, and at night they would descend on the city and ply their trade at being prostitutes. So that was known, that was accepted in that culture. Ryan. Exactly. Right. Yeah. Exactly. So, and you see those kinds of problems in even our port cities. At times, guys get into trouble. Sometimes in those port cities. Okay. Anything else? What we have here is a city of wealth and luxury, perhaps, but also a city established where there was a mixture of people, and they had the best ideas of Greek freedom influencing on one way, but they themselves, even a Corinthian church, were undisciplined and conceited. And so I would say that Corinth was a mixture, go on Ryan's point, of Bourbon Street and Las Vegas, sort of the idea there. Penny. Yes. Exactly. I think that's absolutely right. It's not like they were sitting there saying, "Oh, how horrible everybody else is around us. How horrible the culture is we live in. Oh, aren't they terrible?" They were doing the same things, and also they were accepting those things, and yeah. That's a big thing. It's them and us, right? I think that's what you're saying. Yeah, it was part of the way they lived. Yeah, there are 3 chapters on eating meats. 3 chapters. So, it's a big deal. It's a problem in the church. Yes. Yeah. Right. 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 Exactly. Right. Okay. Time of the establishment. Well, let me. Time of the Corinthian church establishment. We probably can fix this better than almost any church we know of. The reason we could do that is archaeology. In the Acts, there's a new Roman proconsul or governor. His name, I looked this up, how it's pronounced. It's Gallio is the way that I wouldn't want to say Gallio or Gallio or something, but it's Gallio. And he came to Corinth in AD 51. There's an inscription at Delphi, Greece that talks about him in AD 51 becoming the governor there. He was known by historians for his charm and his gentleness, and in Acts 18, the hostile Jews, I think, tried to take advantage of him being a newcomer to town and also having a reputation for charm and gentleness, trying to take advantage of that. And you know the story, they bring charges against Paul for teaching against the law. But Gallio is going to have none of it. He might be charming and gentle, but he's going to have none of this. And he basically is going to judge based on Roman law, impartial Roman law, so he refuses to do anything. He does allow Sosthenes, we may talk about him in a minute, but he does allow Sosthenes to be beaten up in his presence. But he has nothing, he washes his hand of the matter. But after all this violence that occurred, in Acts, we find out Paul leaves Corinth. And, 1 Corinthians gives us a lot about Paul and the establishment of the church, but the best description is Acts 18, 1 through 17, and we'll read that if we have time at the end. But Acts 18, 1 through 17 is the story of the church establishment and some of the things that happened in the church in Corinth. When this church was established, it was a really crisis-ridden time for Paul. It was his busiest time, and we think that he wrote a lot of the letters from Corinth. Actually, you can argue this forever, but it's thought that Thessalonians, Corinthians, Galatians, Romans, possibly Philippians, and Philemon were written at this time. Well, not from Corinth, but at this time of being around Corinth. He was really busy with the churches in Corinth and Ephesus. And this was also a time when there was a lot of problems with opposition arising, particularly for him teaching to the Gentiles. And it got stronger and stronger and stronger. And Paul was also interested in this collection for the Jewish poor during this period. Well, about 3 or 4 years after Paul moved on from working with the Corinthian church, he was at Ephesus, and he'd received a lot of questions from the Corinthian church about marriage and other matters. And perhaps there were a couple of delegations that came to talk to him to Ephesus from Corinth. One was Chloe's household and one was Stephanas' household. And basically the underlying theme was things were not too good at Corinth. And there was a divisive spirit loose in the church. From 1 Corinthians 5:9, we find out that there was a letter that predated 1 Corinthians. He had already written them a letter before. We call it 1 Corinthians. We may have 2nd or 3rd Corinthians, who knows. But there was a letter. 5:9, he describes the letter he'd already written. And he said, we can only guess about its contents. But we can guess about its contents from chapter 5. But he was busy with the work at Ephesus, so he was not able to just drop everything and go to Corinth to kind of straighten things out. So we think this prompted him to write 1 Corinthians, and then later reports based on reports he'd received from the church. There were a lot of tensions going on at the Corinthian church when Paul gets this information. First off, it seems that there were 4 well-defined factions within the church, so they had a problem with unity. Second thing is high level. There was an idea of arrogance. It comes up again and again. It kind of goes with what Penny said. It's arrogance about, we're kind of smarter than you are. We are tolerant of all these things. We kind of can get with it with the program here with this Corinthian culture. Boasting was a problem. We had immorality in the church. People were proud of their tolerance. Some people put a lot of stock in wisdom. People had put a lot of stock in their ability to speak eloquently, or others' ability to speak eloquently. They put a lot of emphasis on knowledge and power and signs of power such as charismatic gifts. They evidently thought too much about themselves and a little too much about human wisdom and knowledge, and probably too little about the grace of God. I think that's one of their big problems. And so if you think about it, while they thought they knew a lot, they were really immature in their faith. They were spiritual babies. And I think Paul kind of addresses that. A couple of things that I think important here to realize that this 1 Corinthians is not an exhaustive theological treatment of all the questions, but I think they're responses to the most urgent ones. I think Paul planned a visit to them shortly, and so he was going to make a quick dash off of things that, immediate concerns. And then it seems that he was also concerned that he was being accused, sort of like the Galatian letter. He was being accused of, you don't care, you're not here anymore, so you don't care about us anymore. There's that comes through in 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. And the other idea that comes through is that you don't care about us anymore, Paul, and we're kind of questioning your leadership. And Paul's going to really address that in 2 Corinthians a lot. But they were accusations that they were making against Paul. About the letter itself, a couple of things. First thing you notice, this truly is a letter. Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians that he was more effective on paper than he was in person. He was a better writer than he was a preacher. And he kind of alludes to that. The letters, we know, were dictated to a secretary, and they had, all the standard features you find in a letter: greetings, thanksgiving, and then there's the body of the letter itself. And, it was always a custom in the early churches to read these letters from Paul, and they would be read aloud to the entire congregation, and they kind of were used as an oral address, sort of like a sermon. They were read to everyone. So that's the way they were, and they were passed around to various churches. So copies were made and passed around. The problem with the letter is it's a one-sided conversation. I know sometimes if I get a phone call and I know it's from Penny's dad or from one of the kids, it's like I hear this. Yeah? Oh no. Oh no. Okay, well then my blood pressure goes way up just to hear that. Or, oh, that's great. You're kidding. Well, my blood pressure's up because I want to know what that is, We're hearing one side of a conversation here in many cases. So we have to deduce and make a lot of assumptions about things. But the idea is that, knowing, there's a lot of clues in the letter about what's going on here. So I think we can pretty well tell many things that are important. Okay, this whole idea about 1 Corinthians being a larger set of correspondence, there may be 4 or 5 actually letters written here. I think we know there are 4. There could be even 5 here. But 1 Corinthians is not, again, as I said, the first letter to the Corinthians. And 1 Corinthians chapters 7 through 16 are responses to questions received from the church in Corinth. It's kind of Paul's Q&A. It's just like Paul doing a Q&A, and he's standing there and he's taking these questions one at a time. Okay, I'll stop again. I'm sorry, this is kind of a lecture type thing instead of a, back and forth. But if you have anything, please interrupt. Okay, after the first letter in 1 Corinthians 5:9, that's the first one we know about. Again, he wrote several, 2 or maybe 3 more letters, and we may or may not have possession of these letters. Let me explain about that. We might have, but some people have tried to explain it. Maybe we have all of this. That a lot of these were written in parchment, and some of these may be spliced into the letters that we actually have. There are a couple of different ways to explain 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. One is that this was a really turbulent time for Paul in his life. There's a lot of things going on, and sometimes scholars read 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, there's some unevenness. It's not as linear, it's not as beautifully constructed as the book of letter to the Romans, which a letter is, But the idea is there's some unevenness in tone. Sometimes he's up, sometimes he's down, sometimes it's disjointed. And scholars, some say that, these were composed in less than good condition. Sometimes these letters, some of them they've been done very quickly. And some of them may be like a letter where you started something and a few days lapse, an email you forget about, and you go back and you write it again, and it's a different type of thing. Okay, so you got to look at some of the disjointness and unevenness of being just more like a personal letter. It's not a theological treatise when you write a letter or an email to a friend. The second explanation is that there are fragments of the letters that are included in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And, there are a lot of complex theories. Just let me go down a couple of rabbit holes, okay, if we can. A couple of complex theories about that, a couple of possibilities. 1 Corinthians 5:9 says that I've written you in my letter, that was the previous letter to 1 Corinthians, not to associate with sexually immoral people, etc., etc. Some people think that 2 Corinthians 6:14 through 7:1 may have been Paul's previous letter, and then that caused the Corinthians to ask questions which he addresses again in 1 Corinthians, starting with really chapter 7. I have to admit, if you read 2 Corinthians and you read it, and I encourage you to read 1 and 2 Corinthians this week, but if you read it and you go all the way from 2 Corinthians 1 through 6:14 or 6:13, you do that, and then you pick up again at 7:2, it flows really well. It's almost like there's something spliced in there, some people think that's part of the missing letter. We know that Paul had several visits to Corinth that weren't recorded in the book of Acts, and it appears that some of his visits didn't go very well, and things actually may have gotten worse. In 2 Corinthians 7:8, Paul says, "Even if I caused you sorrow by my letter, I do not regret it. Though I did regret it, I see that my letter hurt you, and not only for a little while, yet I'm happy, not because you were made sorrowful, but because your sorrow led you to repentance. For you became sorrowful as God intended, and so were not harmed in any way by us." And a lot of scholars think this was the tearful letter, or severe letter, they call it. And they think that's the 2 Corinthians 6:14 through 7:1. And then there are others who think that it's actually 2 Corinthians 10 through 13. If you read 2 Corinthians 1 through 9, it's going to be very happy, happy, joy, joy, reconciliation, love, and peace. And then you read 10 through 13, all of a sudden, whoa, something's happened there. Very severe. So some people say that a couple of things may have happened. One is that Paul was actually, writing this. He got good news, and he wrote 1 through 9. And then he travels. He wants to find out how things are going. He meets some brethren in Macedonia. He travels. He can't go all the way to Corinth, but he meets some people, and they come over to Macedonia, and they're telling Paul things aren't good. They didn't receive that letter very well. So he dashes off 10 through 13. That's one theory. The other theory is that they reversed that. They told him things were good. He wrote the letter, the difficult letter, and things were good. And then so he writes this beautiful 1 through 9 kind of letters of reconciliation. All right, that's not important. We do have what we have to do. We need to know what God is telling us to do. All that's not important, but I thought it would be kind of interesting. If you're reading through that and you say, wait a minute, that's kind of jumping thoughts. That's kind of one of two or three of the theories that are involved. I was going to spend the rest of my time talking about some of the people in the church, because you can understand a little bit of the influences. If you look at your handout, Paul, of course, we know the story from Acts 18, and I would also encourage you to read Acts 18 this week if you would. It talks a lot about that. So I'm not going to say much more about Paul, but we know he didn't do very well in Athens on his Greek tour. He was in Macedonia and came to Athens, didn't do very well there. And so he moves on to Corinth, and this was one of his most productive works, 18 months he spent there. Ephesus, he spent 3 years, but this was his second most lengthy period of time to stay there. All right. Another person we're introduced to really quick is Apollos. And Apollos was, from Alexandria, Egypt. He was a gifted speaker. He was probably an intellectual. A lot of people, there was a faction that followed him in the church. And so the other thing that we know of was that, about Apollos is there was evidently a rivalry. Some people point to a rivalry between Apollos and Paul. Just getting started. Okay. But that's an interesting thing. Aquila or Timothy, protege of Paul. I've got a lot of notes on that. Protege of Paul. He becomes really more important. One thing is interesting in terms of the importance there. Timothy, did I have Silas in there? I think I left Silas out. Oh my. Silas was an important leader in the early church. He was with the Jerusalem church, and he took the letter back. He was selected as one of two people to go with Paul and Barnabas to deliver the Jerusalem council letter back to Antioch. Very important, and he became Paul's trusted traveling companion. Timothy was Paul's protege. We know about him. It's interesting that Silas sort of decreases in the story in the New Testament, and Timothy increases in his importance, particularly as to Paul. Timothy was a great mediator. He was a teacher. He really taught churches to try to ground them. After Paul had taught and left, he was there to sort of ground them. Titus, another important person. I think about Kendall Harrison when I think about Titus. He was Paul's enforcer. We don't know much about his teaching and preaching ability, but he was a good mediator. He was a negotiator. He was the person who really spent a lot of time trying to be a problem solver between Paul and the churches. He was a tough personality. Peter probably never went to Corinth. We don't know he went to Corinth. May have. But there was people that were really loyal to him. Perhaps that was through Silas's influence. Silas and Peter were pretty tight in the Jerusalem church. Perhaps Silas had an influence and people developed an affinity with Peter. There's Tertius. Don't know much about him, but he was a secretary writing from Rome to Corinth. Crispus, very important person. I really want to get to Crispus. The ruler of the synagogue. We know from archaeology that rulers of synagogues were very wealthy people. And he probably, Paul's work took off when he converted Crispus and his household. That was probably the beginning when the work really took off at that time. And so he was very influential. And as a Jew, he would also understand the intricacies of Old Testament, the Old Testament in trying to predict Christ and Jesus Christ's coming. Gaius, personally baptized by Paul. Titius Justus was a Gentile God-fearer. That was a class of people who were not proselytes, but they were very, very much accepted, and they were very much they didn't want to go all the way to be proselytes, but they also did very much admire Judaism. Sosthenes, I want to spend time on Sosthenes. If he's the same Sosthenes that's mentioned in 1 Corinthians, if that's the same guy that was beaten up by the crowd, that may say that, and Greg and I talked about this, Sosthenes was converted. He was beaten up by the crowd in front of Gallio, but he was converted. So he probably represented deep roots in Judaism. Chloe's people, probably she was from a class of very influential women that were in the Gentile world at this time. Think Lydia, probably a type, she was head of her household. Stephanas, first people baptized in Greece by Paul, and he had a lot of leadership in the church. And we have some other people, like Achaicus and Lucius Jason Sopater are my kinsmen. Probably they were Jews. There was a woman mentioned named Phoebe, the deaconess, and she was from Cenchreae, which is it was a suburb of Corinth. We had to include her there. Paul includes her there. But she had a lot of influence, and Paul commended her for her leadership and service in the church. One person he doesn't give a name is a person who was committing the gross immorality in 1 Corinthians. He doesn't dignify that person with a name, but that's another character that we know about in the church. All right, from your handout, kind of summarizing major themes of the letter, the problem with unity in the church, arrogance in the church. He talks about his ministry to the Corinthians, and he talks about what impact this has. Goes to Penny's point. What impact does this have on your ability to influence others in your community? I think it's a matter of, this is not just a church problem. It's a church problem that everybody else, the pagans are seeing, and you're not living any better than they are. So that's a problem. And then chapters 7 through 16 are really addressing the Q&A. It's Paul's Q&A. Marriage, eating sacrificial meats, 3 chapters on that. Proper Christian worship, spiritual gifts, 3 chapters on that, including our wonderful 1 Corinthians 13 about love. And then 15 and 16 is about questions about the resurrection of the dead. So there's a whole lot of no pun intended, a whole lot of meat, not offered to idols, but a whole lot of meat in this whole area. I'm excited about this study. Anybody have any comment to close? No, not you. It's a fascinating book. It's just a fascinating book, and again, I think it's going to be a great prequel sequel to Galatians. All right, let's have a quick word of prayer. Our Father, we're thankful for the blessings you give us. We're thankful that you've given us your wonderful word, and we're thankful that the Spirit guided Paul in writing 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. And we're just thankful, Father, for what it tells us to do and how we're supposed to live today. Father, many times we don't know how to live today. We sometimes don't do a very good job of it. And we pray, Father, through our study that we will appreciate more the problems of that age, but also how they apply to our age. Just thankful, Father, for your great wisdom and just what you've done to actually give us your word. It's such a wonderful gift. We're most especially grateful for your Son, Jesus, and the great gift that he is, and how through his sacrifice we have salvation. In Jesus' name, amen.